All right, friends. Thanks for joining us. Welcome on this Tuesday as we begin the second chapter of the Gospel of John. Some schedule interruptions recently slowed us down a little bit. We'll get back into it. Probably not fast progress today, but we are getting into the heart of the narrative. There's a thing that we run into today that is helpful to know about the Gospel of John. John presents, Bible scholars look at John, and as they look at all the content, there are a couple of things that happens in groups of 7, and one of them is called the 7 signs of John. So there are 7 miracles or 7 things that John presents Jesus doing, and then they sort of set up the stage for who Jesus is. And we get that today. Today's the first sign, and John will even tell us that as we get to the end of this section. A pretty familiar story, though a unique story. One of those stories that's only in the Gospel of John. We don't have this story anywhere else, don't know anything about it, its origin or where it came from, what tradition or why it is that John alone has it, but it is the case. Let me read down through this 4 ways, and we'll come back and talk it through. On the 3rd day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now, standing there were 6 stone jars, water jars for the Jewish rite of purification. Each held 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. We can go ahead and stop there as we move into this. So lots of things happening. There is a midweek wedding, and Jesus, his disciples, and his mother, not yet named, are all there. They've all been invited to the wedding. Now, in Jesus' culture, in Jesus' day, weddings were often a very large celebration, sometimes a week's worth or several days' worth of kind of activities and events, a big deal. And so Jesus here is with the wedding and hears from his mother, they have no wine. Now, people who study culture, the scholars, the ones who know something about what this would mean, the hospitality customs, this would be a massive failure, Michael. This would be the kind of thing that people would talk about. Mm-hmm. It would be, I don't know if we call it offensive, but I don't know if we naturally, I mean, yes, it's a bummer to run out of food, right? But this is more akin to sin than a mistake from a cultural perspective. I'm not saying running out of wine is a sin. I'm saying that this would be something held against this family and talked about. It's a big deal.
Yeah, it absolutely is, Clint. I think that's an interesting way into the text is to recognize that in this culture and in this time, hospitality to the stranger has a much higher place in culture than it certainly does today in a Western culture, if you're in America, or at least many places in America. But even beyond that, Clint, and I think you're right to point out, this is the height of a family's hospitality. It is a kind of service to the community. A wedding is not a one day with a reception to follow type event. This is a week-long kind of party. And, if you've ever known someone who maybe went and married someone in another country, maybe in India or maybe somewhere in the Middle East, a lot of times, even today, weddings are a much more extended affair, sometimes lasting an entire day or multiple days. And this kind of event would have been far more akin to that. Highly planned, highly orchestrated, each one of those steps having different meanings and different connections. And community was such an important part of this event. It was the family showing hospitality for everyone in the community. So that's, Clint, where I think this story has such interesting implications, because if you're a person reading this today, you might think to yourself, they ran out of wine, big deal. Jesus is doing this miracle or being called to this miracle, big deal. Why is this the sign that John starts? But there are so many different layers to this. We won't explore them all today. But the first is very simply that this miracle to its first reader would have made sense. It would have had a kind of gravity to it, a kind of weight to it, that Jesus didn't just provide drink for the celebration, though he did that. The point of this is ultimately Jesus helped a family save face. And even more than that, his mother seems to have some knowledge, some role in the planning or execution of this ceremony. He may have done so for his mother as well, that there was a way in which Jesus completed a thing which was coming off the rails, to be quite frank, and it would have meant something to the people who it would have embarrassed. So Jesus is setting something right that has significant importance to the community, and that you're right to start this there.
Yeah, I don't know what the modern equivalent would be, but if a person of Jesus' day was reading this and they ran out of wine, we read that as a detail, that would make them uncomfortable.
Yeah,
That would be shocking and disrupting for them. Now, the fact that Jesus is there, Mary is there, the disciples are there, some have speculated that this may have been some kind of extended family connection to Jesus. That's all. John doesn't tell us all the details we wish that he would. And so John's stories are always ripe with opportunities to kind of try and fill in the gaps. That's fun to do, but ultimately we most often don't know any of those details, but some have suggested that this is a family wedding. Anyway, Jesus' mother, troubled by this, says, they have no wine. And Jesus says, what sounds to us disrespectful, woman, what concern is that of yours and mine? Now, woman is not a sign of disrespect. It's actually a respectful term. Ma'am, miss, it is not the way that it translates in English quite. And then he says a strange thing, my hour has not yet come. And I think maybe this is the first time we've run into it, Michael, but the word hour is significant in the Gospel of John. We're going to see it over and over again. And maybe a more English way to think about it is my time. And for John, Jesus' time is going to be his work on the cross. When he refers to his hour, it's that work of redemption that he is headed toward ultimately. Remember, we've told you that the Gospel of John doesn't backload that like Mark does, or even the Synoptics. That's on the table from the very first page in John. And so we know right away there is that moment, there is that time coming when Jesus is going to forfeit his life. We've already been told that already, that we're headed that direction. And so here he says, this doesn't have, in other words, this isn't my ministry. What does this have to do with me? And as a typical mother, she just goes right about her plan. She says to the servants, do whatever he tells you. So again, whether this is some kind of silent conversation between Jesus and his mom, I'm not doing it. And she looks at him and says, okay, do what he tells you, that they sell. Again, all those fun kind of places to speculate and imagine. But the short version is Mary, by decision or by inclination or by intuition, she knows that Jesus is going to act. And so she tells the servants, do whatever he tells you.
There's so many different places where I think this story does fire our imaginations, and some of them we might just read by without really seeing some of the meaning behind it. I think we continue in the text, Clint, into verse 6, and we find one of those things, 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification. That's an interesting detail, right? The Jewish rites of purification. You might just read by that and say, fascinating detail. Never. In John, you never read by these things and them just sort of be descriptors. This has meaning because, and I know that we can't rush ahead as much as I'd like to skip ahead in the book of John, certainly talk about the crucifixion scene where, by the way, this scene gets figured a little bit, symbolized a little bit, or at least called to mind a little bit. But what you have right here is a explicit reference to water and to wine. The vessels that would hold purifying water are the vessels that will hold the wine that Jesus Christ will make. It is a unbelievably rich, spiritual, symbolic gesture. This idea that the place where the people turn for their hearts to be cleansed is the place that they're going to drink from. And you, if you've been in any Christian church, you will recognize that image of drinking from the cup. Clearly, that is an image we get in absolute purest form in the Last Supper when Jesus himself offers wine to his disciples. So, Clint, if you came to a story like this and you thought it sounded strange that that his first miracle recorded, a book that gives such high credence to the deity of Christ, who he is, then you might find it strange. Well, why is this the miracle that we see at the beginning? Why is this the first sign that is offered? And I think as we go through this story, as we see these details, it starts to paint a bigger picture that connects throughout the whole book that will follow, that Jesus is the one who's going to fulfill what the purification rites themselves couldn't do. And like a wise preacher or a discerning preacher, John is providing both a narrative of what's happening, but also some of the spiritual insight of what it means. And it's both being delivered to us at the same time.
Yeah, I think when you come to the miracle stories, particularly these 7 sign stories, the two things that are helpful to keep in mind is the quality and the quantity. And we see that here in John's first story. John gets to use the word purification. People who study this stuff say that, between 120 and 180 gallons of water is a lot for a wedding of that day. But John is about extravagance in this case. And so not only is there going to be an exceptional vintage of wine, but an exceptional amount of it as well. So he fills them up to the brim. Now let's pick up the story. He said to them, "Now draw some out, take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine, he did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. The steward called the bridegroom and said, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine when the guests have been drinking. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brother, and his disciples, and they remained there a few days. So again, now John covers a ton of ground very quickly. Draw some out, they do. It's become wine. It's fascinating, for as popular and well known as this miracle is, in any Jesus reference, secular or religious, water into wine is known. This is somehow characteristic of Jesus's abilities and Jesus's miracles. This one stands out to people, and yet notice that John says absolutely nothing about how it happens. Jesus doesn't need help in the Gospel of John. Jesus doesn't need explanation, really, in any of the Gospels. But here it's as simple as water goes in, wine comes out. That's all you got to know. The steward takes it, tastes the wine, and he calls the bridegroom and says, "Look, most people put their best wine out first to impress everybody, and then as they've been drinking, they get less and less discerning. But you saved the best until last." So what do we have? We have an incredible amount, 150 gallons or so, of the best wine there, including the wine that they started with, which would have been what they intended. So why does John do this? Because that's what Jesus produces, an abundance of the best. And so we see already here John starting patterns that he's going to come back to later.
It's not just, Clint, what Jesus has done or is going to do. It's also partly who Jesus is, because think about the history of Israel. Over all of the ages have come the prophets who have declared the word of God. He's declared God's intention over and over and over again. And here when Jesus arrives, then suddenly it's the best. Jesus' arrival marks the moment upon which everything culminates, including this very sign that Jesus does, right? All of the wine that comes previous is now inferior in the face of what Jesus creates. And I think John, as the first miracle, is connecting this whole picture, Clint. He's connecting the history of the people and the things that they thought were good that he's now going to transfigure. It's all going to be changed in light of his glory and grace. And then also you're going to see how now Jesus is going to continue to amaze. He's not just going to change the lot for a family at a wedding. He's also going to teach and reveal to the disciples everything that is true about how God has changed the world and who Jesus is. And I think it's worth noting at the end of verse 11 that this then leads to further signs. This is just the first of his signs in Galilee, and it reveals his glory. And don't miss, what are the disciples' response to that glory? They believe in him. And that's shorthand, not just for what happened to the disciples, but an invitation for you in this first sign that you too might see it and believe. And John is going to continue to unpack this in the words, stories, signs to come.
Which I think is a reason that John prefers the word sign to miracle. I think that John thinks in terms of signs, because what do signs point to something, right? Miracles are incredible, and certainly this is miraculous. But for John, it's not only that. It is a thing that points you towards something deeper, something better. And so this is the first of the signs of the guidance posts. This is the first thing that Jesus did for the people that begins to give them an awareness of who he is. And so the disciples then respond, because how does one always respond in John when they encounter the power of Christ? With belief. They believe in him. And so a really interesting story. We don't know why this is unique to John. It's a fascinating way to start the gospel at a small-ish family event in an out-of-the-way place. And yet that is the first inkling for those who see it. Notice, maybe not for everybody, but for those who saw what happened, an amazing sign of who this man is. Now, we don't really have a lot of time to go into it. I'll just point you in the direction. If you wanted to dig into the Old Testament, even a pretty quick internet search on wine and Bible, once you got through all the arguments about whether Christians should drink or not, wine and Old Testament would give you a lot of resources of the importance of wine, the wine of wrath, the wine of blessing, the vineyard imagery in the Old Testament. Wine is a rich metaphor in the story of God's people for their relationship with God and for what God promised to do to them in both good circumstances and bad circumstances. And so wine is not a random ingredient here. Wine is central to the storytelling of the faith people, and that'll come back. We'll see that again, but just know that there are roots to this that are deep.
No doubt. And I hope that with all of that said, there's something here today that's been encouraging, maybe new to you, and let you see this story in a new way. And certainly hope that you might subscribe so that you could stick with us here as we go through the rest of these signs and the entire book of John, which is a rich, rich story to come. So, subscribe. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Thanks for listening.